everyone. Welcome to Senate Education, Friday, January 12th. Two pieces of business today. We're going to start with Jessica Carolis and her team to talk to us about community schools, give us some history on the bill that we passed a couple years ago now, how that all played out. We're going to hear an update on Universal School Meals from North Portland, the Executive Director of Hunger Free Vermont, and Rosie Kruger with the Agency of Education. Jess, thanks for coming down. Great to see you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Do you know everybody here?
I do.
Great.
I do. And for the record, I'm Jessica Carolis. I'm Division Director of the Student Pathways Division at the Agency of Education. I'd love to invite up my colleague, Bernice.
Love to have
Garnett. Dr. Garnett is from UVM, and we established a research practice partnership in the first year, Bernice and I, which sounds very formal, but it started just with a phone call. But it has become something a bit more formal.
So Dr. Garnett,
Yeah.
Is it Garnett?
Garnett, yeah.
You're with UVM.
Correct.
Are you also with the agency?
No, so I'm an associate professor in the College of Education and Social Services at UVM.
Terrific. Great
Yeah.
to have you here.
And if I may, I would also like to introduce our colleague, Peter Knox,
Sure.
who is behind here providing some technical support, but also is been part of the research practice partnership and
Great.
is also a research associate.
Great.
At UVM. Yeah. So, how much do you know about the community schools?
So this group was not on the committee
Okay.
when we passed it, nor were, I think, how many years have you been in the Senate?
First session.
Okay, so none of them were in the Senate either when we passed it.
Mhm. So, before we go to the next slide, Morgan, and there's a link in there. I did want to just say that, so in 2021, Act 67 was passed, the Community Schools Act, but it's really specific to Vermont. So while the 4 national pillars are included around community schools, Vermont added a 5th pillar around safe, equitable, and inclusive school communities. And I think that really sort of tracks to some of our landmark legislation around Act 1 or Act 173, et cetera, and ensuring that we have safe, healthy, inclusive school communities. It was about $3.2 million that was appropriated. We competed a program. There was in the legislation requirement that funds would be distributed by September 1st. As you may recall, the bill was passed in June.
Yeah.
So it was a delightful July 4th of hustling to pull that together, but also understanding that in the middle of a pandemic, and that was the most intense phase, over a summer in which many of the staff were desperately in need of some respite. We did have 6 applicants and 5 were awarded. And we chose to copy a model similar to 21st century community learning schools, which is best practice when you're doing something like this, which is, it's not an initiative, it's not a model, it's a way of doing school. It's so wholly inclusive to provide 3-year awards. So
If you don't mind, let me just go back for a second. Districts applied,
districts are
received
eligible
6,
entities.
and
Applications.
5 were
5 applications were awarded.
awarded.
Yes.
Okay. And we did this just to give a little bit more background, and you might be jumping in this as well, but we really wanted to see how this would work. We had one in Bennington for years, Molly Stark School. Still has some components of it where you could go every day, physical, dental, mental health check, all these kinds of food. And we wanted to continue to see how it might work and what schools we might identify that really we would put money in going forward. The money was there to continue these services.
Correct. And the requirements of the legislation, it had some very specific components. So one is that folks would have to hire a community school coordinator. National research bears out that it's essential that you have someone who can act as the hub and as a
Center
wheel.
wheels.
Yes.
Might be worth taking 30 seconds. How does a community school differ from all the
We're
others?
going to get into that, right?
Because you
So,
keep referring to it, but I don't really know.
right. So it's a term of art, but the presentation is to give you a sense. And we actually even have a video. We've been using media to try to capture that. So we have a contracted with a videographer to try to sort of distill it. Because again, when you have a community school, it's in the word, right? So we have local control. We have distinct school communities. Not all school communities look the same, but they all center around these 5 pillars: integrated student supports, expanded and enriched learning time, community and family engagement, collaborative leadership, and then this fifth pillar that we added, which is around those safe, inclusive, and equitable school communities. And what we were directed to do is to make sure that anyone who applied, they had to at least hire a community school coordinator. They had to conduct a needs-based or asset mapping. They had to have been trained and engage in PBIS. And they had
Remind
to,
everybody what that is.
positive behavioral interventions and supports. And there are different terms of art that can refer to that, but that was in the legislation. And we did narrow in on communities that could demonstrate need. So free and reduced lunch, they were schools receiving comprehensive or equity supports, or they could make an argument, because at this time too, getting clear data around free reduced lunch numbers started to get a little bit muddy. So folks could make an argument, but most of our folks were hitting that free reduced lunch metric. So we pulled together a competition. Folks applied. We were really delighted to see 6 applications, but we did design a 3-year application, which meant they had to have a very robust and distinct budget for the first year, but they had to say what would they be posing to do under these 5 pillars, very specifically with very specific SMART goals, both what they would do the first year, but what they were hoping to drive at. What was their strategic plan for year 3? And then we have continuation applications in which they would have to resubmit, because we want to have some guard to say, like, if something was really struggling, you don't want to just fund willy-nilly without any sort of oversight. So that's how we structured it. We're going to introduce you a little bit to those folks, but we did want to start, and Morgan, I hopefully you can key up this video.
And we do have it in our folder now, so.
I just need to share this.
I'm going to send you a Vimeo real quick. Morgan, if you're having trouble.
He's got it.
Oh, yes.
See, this is the part of the job. If I were Morgan, I would
Sweating.
sweating. It's only sweat,
Yeah.
and we don't want him to sweat. But it's the part that I just never been able to do. Those words pulling up on the screen. Heart palpitations. All right, there we go. Unlike the rest of your work.
No, I know,
So
me too.
IT.
I get frozen.
Definitely. People fall asleep. Something with.
Is it like a mute button?
Well, I think the problem is that if I have my speakers on, there's an echo if I have the speakers on my computer. So.
You want to try it though?
Yeah, let's give it a shot. Yeah.
wrestling with this because to wrap your arms around like what is doing school. So they are not singular programs, right? It is an approach to schooling, and you can see that really what folks have been focusing on is making sure that both their community and the individuals within the schools who are part of that community are seen and visible. It needs to align with it aligns with the Vermont student-centered approach to learning. All of the work that has come before has been a not only useful but transformative investment, right? So when you pass Act 77, when we adopt the education quality standards, Rule Series 2000, et cetera, what we've done, Act 28, Act 1, right, Act 173, we've laid the foundation that I think a lot of other states, when we've gone and spoken with folks, flexible pathways wasn't already established. There wasn't already permission, the policy permission, to really think dynamically, which is required in community schools. And certainly it closes equity gaps, right? So the focus is on making sure that number one, you want students in the schools. And what are the barriers to students getting to school or being in the school? So you heard from that parent. That parent had someone who worked with her because her daughter was not coming to school. They were arguing every morning. She supervises 20 people. She was showing up late to work, right? Which then, so she was just sort of giving up. She felt guilty, like she wasn't being a good parent because she could not do it. Not only did that student get accepted to CTE, that student started playing an instrument in the band, right? And re-engaged with school. And it's because of a position that was supported through community schools. And while it's one student, you think about the scale and impact of that, right? And then finally, it leverages Vermont's unique context, history, and values. And certainly, I don't think we have to tell you folks about John Dewey, but really this, John Dewey, I think he said, democracy, every generation democracy is born anew and education is its midwife, right? And I think from that perspective and knowing that education plays a fundamental role in sustaining our constitutional democracy, we've had a lot of conversations in this room around civic literacy and equity literacy and Holocaust education. Really what community schools is doing is it's creating a framework for schools to lean into that role of sustaining our constitutional democracy, our ethical democracy, our spiritual democracy. And you mentioned Molly Stark, so we have that. So as I mentioned, it does have several, and this is just a handful of broader policy and initiative connections. And I mention this because what you don't want is you don't want people flagging under initiative fatigue, where they see every single policy as a unique, distinct, disconnected policy that has to be attended to on its own. We need to take all of those threads and knit it into a tapestry that has some color that tells a story, right? So Act 77, Education Quality Standards, Act 173, right? I mean, thinking about enhancing the effectiveness, availability, accessibility, equity of services for students who need additional supports. That's what we just heard. So I don't need to read through all of this. This is just a handful, but even I added in Act 127, and I think it's to be seen.
You want us to be on a different slide?
Oh, sorry. Yes. Sorry, Morgan. I'm being a terrible.
We're advancing here, so it feels like
Yes.
we're advancing.
And now to the next slide. There was Dewey,
Yeah.
and now here's broader policy initiatives. But generally, this idea that the passage of thinking about equitable distribution of funds. We know that national research is very clear about the inequity of funding between public and private, between wealthy communities and less economically diverse or advantaged communities. And so while we're newly doing this and it needs to be monitored, that also belongs here in thinking about how is it that you start to fund those opportunities, and that's that community school coordinator, of tying and knitting it together. You kept hearing the school counselor referencing Sam, right, with this idea that he also said, for the first time, I've actually been able to truly focus on my school counseling because I wasn't trying to solve these other problems that it's not his job, right? And he's like, so I've actually been able to serve like a third more students because I had this person in the school community. Next slide. So I'm going to turn this over to our our doctor, to talk a little bit about
Superintendent doctor.
implementation science, which we've been using as we also were charged with evaluating the implementation of this pilot community school program.
Awesome. So I'm grateful to be here. And just to give you a sense of my background, so my background is actually in public health, and I sit at the nexus between public health and education. And I got my start in this field working actually at a community school in West Philly, where as an undergraduate student, I was able to help provide some of the extracurricular resources to a local school through service learning courses, right? And so John Dewey not only talked about the role of education, but also the role of institutions of higher education to be better partners to their local community. And so I was watching Act 67 pass, and you all know how unique and exceptional Vermont is, but to the national scene, there's a lot of eyes and attention to what's happening in Vermont related to this community school legislation and this pilot program. In addition to being a fifth pillar, you also all drew down COVID set aside dollars to support community schools in a really disruptive time in the pandemic. And there was a lot of national attention to how is a small rural state like Vermont going to stand up this model, because most of the research on community schools is very urban centric. UCLA, Tulsa, Baltimore, Chicago has a totally different landscape when we're talking about community schools being a hub of resources. And in some of our communities, the school is the resource of the community, right? So what does rural community school implementation look like? And that was really our focus. So I reached out to Jess because I was super excited that Vermont was going to lean into its long roots in community schools, right? And in 1999, in the chapter on Molly Stark, they wrote, researchers from Harvard and Yale came to study the Molly Stark School in Bennington in 1999. They said, Vermont is showcasing that community schools' time has come. And you notice Mary Schell, the community school coordinator at Whitebird, said the same thing, but 20 years later, right? And so there is a long history of community schools in Vermont. We just haven't had sustained, systematic policy structure to support it or resourcing. So we're using implementation science. You all work in state government, and many of you know how slow change can happen, right? So this was a 3-year pilot grant program that was initiated in 2021. I don't know if you all remember fall of 2021. I'm a parent of 4 kids. That fall was the most disruptive to schools. Omicron variant hit, right? Masking, vaccinations, there was a change in rules. So that was the year that we wanted our community school grantees to hire community school coordinators and to re-envision and braid together this really exciting program. So we needed to go slow in terms of how we evaluated what schools were doing. And so implementation science gives us a framework from a swath of change of social systems, healthcare organizations, schools, state government, and how long transformative change takes, right? And drawing from the school community and community school literature, we know it takes 3 to 4 years to start seeing procedural and structural change. And I'm offering that as a timeline so we can be compassionate and offer grace to our school communities. They're doing amazing work, and we might not see, we already are actually seeing changes in absenteeism, and that's incredible, right? And so this is just to showcase the stage scaffolded development of how long it takes to stand up a school transformation effort.
Morgan, next slide.
Next slide. And so one of the things that Peter and I, as part of so we're bringing sort of in a research practice partnership, which is what our team is called. Jess has the policy, the deep experience, right? The practitioner side. We're bringing sort of the research evaluation side, but we know that we're not coming in with assumed knowledge. Our community school partners, and they have the expertise and knowledge. We're lifting up their stories through data, right? And to be here together. And so I just wanted to give you a sense of this formula for success, for innovation. And this is exactly what we're studying, right? We know community schools are effective from national literature. In a review of 143 studies, we know that it changes absenteeism, it increases graduation rates, it increases family engagement, it improves school climate, it increases staff retention. But we don't know what that looks like in rural communities, right? So this is a quote here. Community schools help equalize playing field in smaller schools. To give you an example of how our superintendents are thinking about it. Effective implementation methods. What is the role of the community school coordinator in Vermont? We know what it looks like in other places. What's the role here? I get to say yes. Imagine that this funding, this formula, this framework allows people to say yes, right? And then we wanted to know, so Jess and her team at the State Agency of Education has a really unique role in community schools. Outside of the nation, the SEA does not play as supportive role as it does in Vermont. So we really also wanted to study that. And so this is from a community partner up in North Country. An integrated approach with community partners is a roadmap to sustainability. That's a bumper sticker for community partnership, right? And then this is from a school nurse. Talk about socially significant outcomes. We're not raising children, we're raising communities, right? The multi-domain impact of community schools isn't just for the students in the building.
I think you saw one of the community school coordinators sort of tear up when she was
Yes.
talking, right?
Yeah.
When we were speaking with this school nurse, she broke down several times, and I have to tell you, I think it was relief that there was something finally happening. I think she said, finally, we're actually engaging in the kind of health practice that I've been wanting to engage in for so long. It was really tough.
Senator Oshie.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation so far. What I'm trying to understand, and maybe you'll be getting to it soon, is, you know, we're talking about community schools and learning about the implementation in rural areas. And what I'm curious about is, you know, a place like Wardsboro, which is in Windham County and is an hour away from most resources. Where do the resources come from for those more rural schools? You know, where do the nurses come from? Where do the teachers come from that are filling these positions?
And I think you've landed on it. It's sort of what Bernice was referencing, which is even at the national level, when we go to these conferences, there's an assumption, right? Where I worked in a community school. I was one of the community partners when I was in New York City. I taught filmmaking in a after-school program, and we were in 27 schools. And literally, you could just throw a stone and you'd hit a dentist, right, or a health provider or whatever. Here, it is the school in many communities. And so what we found is, while we have shortages in our designated agencies, what's happened is our mental health counselors have gone into the schools. Social workers have taken positions in the schools in order to actually address the population, because people can't get there and they're not staffing, right? So it is in the school.
And let me give you two examples, I think, where our school communities, and this shows the resiliency of rural communities. Actually, in this Cabot, Becca was talking about how they wanted to go inward, actually, that they wanted to leverage their internal resources and assets, as opposed to our first gut assumption is we got to find partners. We don't have enough here. So they wanted to provide an after school program to the elementary school students, right? So Cabot's a PK through 12, tiny school, 120 students in a small white building that doesn't always have consistent heat, right? Let's talk about basic needs.
It's just yes or no heat.
Yes, and yes
It's on or
is
it's off.
100 degrees and no is 50 degrees potentially. Anyway, so the students get to vote if it's on or off. And the day we were there was off because you're shoulder season. But they hire, train, and pay their middle school and high school students to run the after school program with adult supervision. But that's how they got the resources. They looked inwards, right? In Hazen, they're leveraging telehealth, which is something we're trying to scale up, where the school nurse has a really unique partnership with Northern Encounters. They bought a standing mobile unit that can go to the 8 schools in that district, and they can have a partnership with the local primary care where students don't have to drive to Berlin and miss an hour to get a strep test, and you can have, using technology, having a digital audio scope, and the doctor calls into the school nurse and they're able to do it right there on site. They're also leveraging that for tele-psychiatric help. So students don't have to go to Morrisville to get their vitals, to get their medication they need, and they can do that with the telehealth standing unit. So I think there's really innovative ways that our rural schools are doing this in ways that we wouldn't have known if we weren't looking for it.
And it's the same with the adults, right? Because we know that staffing positions, let alone finding a substitute for a position, is a real challenge right now. So that literally the vision is also we can serve our adults in the building without having to maybe have kids in a study hall because you couldn't find a sub and it's just you don't have your math teacher today. So it has enormous possibilities. It's not perfect. I would say that with some of the work that folks did with initial partners, sometimes that was a hiccupy, because I think what happened is people hear about money and so they kind of come like, well, you know, pay me. That's not the model for community schools, right? Community schools is not transactional, right? It's relational. And it's how do you bring to bear your expertise and your own resources, not to duplicate, but to really have that kind of robust whole vision. Next slide, please. So we've been referencing these folks. These were the awardees. So CCSU came in, it was Cabot, who was the applicant. Orleans Southwest was Hazen Union High School. North Country came in as an entire supervisory union. Addison Northwest came in as an elementary school, and White River Valley came in with their one of their middle schools. So we had a very great representation of the unique and myriad governance structures that we have in public education in Vermont. But it was really powerful. So they didn't stay there. We're 2.5 years in.
Yeah.
And the first year, literally, Hazen could not find a community school coordinator. And so the principal did the work on his own. But we have gone,
Hazen High School or?
Hazen Union High School, yeah.
The high school.
Yeah. They've gone from 16 community schools to 28 community schools. We've seen expansion and 2 additional districts, and serving 3,500 students to 5,223 students. And so, tip of the hat, this is all their work, right? And their enthusiasm, and certainly highly invested superintendents, principals, and community school coordinators. Very strong superintendent participation. How are we doing on time?
You have until 2 o'clock.
Okay, so I think we've sort of talked about this a little bit, but we were really designing for equity and sustainability. As Bernie said, she reached out the first year because what did not come with the legislation was a position to manage the $3.5 million. So I did it. And so when the first year it was, I will just say yes. I will take every phone call. At the end of that year, I stopped doing that. But I was very grateful because as soon as we connected, it was like, yes, we've been doing some participatory action research in some of our districts where I was sending in my content specialists to refine their proficiency hierarchies. And so really this fit really well with this idea of community action research. Next slide, please. To support our community school cohort, we developed personalized tools based on their grant applications. We had quarterly check-ins with individual awardees, but then we also had quarterly cohort meetings. And every year we've conducted end-of-year empathy interviews, which we then code. And happy to have together. Happy to have Bernice describe that process a little bit if folks are interested. And then from that, we started to develop some specific evaluation tools. And next slide, I think you went to it, Morgan. We had the next slide. This is an example of logic models that we started to develop, right, with this idea of like what are the ultimate outcomes. And you can see Hazen, Jason, Dr.
This is Matt.
Julio.
This is Matt.
Oh, is that Matt?
Yeah.
Okay, but this is
Hazen, yeah.
But Jason has it up too. They use that. They sort of keep an eye on it. And often you find that community school coordinators they have their pillars up and they'll get a problem and they're like looking across the pillars to be like, okay, what might we bring together to solve this problem?
So you have one person in the school then for these positions, or for the community schools. And this person is the extra hands, feet on the ground that says, okay, so-and-so needs the doctor's appointment, so-and-so needs that, coordinating all of those kinds of
Making the
things.
connection and also being able to go out into the community. Because
Okay.
you can't have the nurse leave the building.
Sure,
You
and
can't-
what qualifications do you need?
So
Because I can see where it would be pretty flexible, I would
Mhm.
think.
a lot of folks come from backgrounds in which they've done community organizing, social work, right? Work-based learning, those types of positions where their orientation is around that school community space, that third space,
You
right?
would train them. You,
No,
or was on
no,
the
I mean,
ground?
these are folks who have professional.
Okay, so
degrees,
they've come
yeah.
in, okay, got it.
They have to go through the
Sure,
process of being in a school and licensed and, background checked.
And there's a national, network of community school coordinators that
Thank
is
you.
free.
Yeah,
that
we
they can-
provided like a
that's great.
draft job description that they could then personalize to their communities.
I'm happy to hold my question to the end, but I am just wondering, is it an endorsement?
It's not an endorsement, but I've been working with our licensing team to see, because we do want to make sure too that if we ask people to do this,
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about our ethical responsibility, I will own that I was of mixed opinion having worked in community schools when this came down the pike. And my one holdout was, you're going to ask people to hire people and to do something with money that we know is going to run out.
I know.
So what's our responsibility to those folks and to the communities that we've now
Fair point.
invited
I know.
that to expect more from the school, and they're not gonna understand when the school stops doing something, that it's not because they don't want to,
They just don't have money.
they don't have money to
And
do
we
it.
did have that conversation. We felt that we give it a shot. It's time, the pandemic. Colin was a big leader in this. I want to recommend Colin Robinson. He really helped with this. And hopefully you also got some research out of it so that people can sort of now say, all right, we've seen the difference. Maybe we can make these investments.
Next slide, Mark. So again, just thinking about this sort of ethical framework, one of the pieces too was to make sure that I knew that we at the agency were going to have to do things differently, right? And you would have to sort of flatten that hierarchy or like, you know, give up the one-up relationship a bit and to be available. And I will say that it would be a fair critique to say, was I as available as I could be? Probably, most definitely the answer is no, but really to just be there for that problem solving. But we did have those predictable 8 kind of touch points across the year. But also to say that, you know, when we want to hold people accountable, it is imperative that we provide the support so that they can be accountable. No one goes into this work to do badly. I mean, unless you're like a psychopath, right? So like really everyone wants to do well.
Yeah.
And so our job was to find out what were some of those barriers. And I would say that universally, most of my conversations were, I think you need to do less, right? Because it was like feeling that sense of urgency and just wanting to meet every need, but really to be like, you need to be alive at the end of this, right? So we're working through the, next slide, Morgan. This is some of the work that we've been doing around processing outcome evaluation. We are building a Vermont portrait of a community school. Oh, sorry.
Can I interrupt you? I apologize. I'm gonna go back to my original question. We're about 40 minutes into the presentation. I still don't understand how a community school differs from a school in a community.
Yeah. So community school is one that fully leans into things like scheduling doctor's appointments for families, providing mental health counseling, having telehealth on campus, providing meals, coordinating across social services to find housing for
Is
family.
curriculum any different?
Curriculum, what we're finding, and I have a slide for this, we're finding we're getting closer to implementation of already existing regulation. So what you're finding is there's more project-based learning, there's more proficiency-based learning, there is more flexible pathway, place-based learning. And we interviewed one parent, and it was pretty extraordinary because he was teaching in the after-school program at one of the sites. And I said, well, why are you doing this? And he said, I'd do anything for this principal. 3 years ago, my son couldn't read. And through project-based learning and re-engaging him, not only can he read, but no one knows he's on an IEP now, right? So we've seen greater coordination of curriculum, greater integration of flexible pathways into that coordinated curriculum.
Is it an entire, you got 5 schools, is it the full school or the full district in one case?
It varies, right? So North Country came in as a district, as a supervisory union, and I think there's 12 districts. What is that, 46 successful? But you know, then you have Cabot, which is a K-12, right? So it does vary, and that was one of the challenges that we had to sort of embrace, is to say, how are we going to recognize that we have myriad governance structures within Vermont, and that we have to accommodate that to some degree. We do have to produce this evaluation. I think it's due next year, and we're midstream, and we're hoping that we can sort of get to some recommendations. There's some that are already developing around, would we have a SU come in initially again, or would we have someone focus first on a school and build out? Like those kinds of things. I'm probably leaning in that direction based on what we're seeing, but overall, we're seeing that it is expanding.
Senator Sheehan,
Just a response to Senator Weeks. The way from what I'm understanding, the way I'm wrapping my head around it is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but you know, these community schools, the way I'm thinking of it is that they're really just community centers that with a focus on school, you know, and instead of the traditional model being, there's a dentist in this town over here, there's a counselor in this other town over here. It's bringing all these resources outside of these different silos to have them in this one location for easier access.
Right. It's
How am I?
100%. It's, I'm having trouble. I can't get my kid to school. And instead of being like, well, I guess we're gonna call DCF, it's, let me work with you. Let's see if we can get her back in the door, right? And I think that when you think about someone then re-engaging and persisting, certainly if the school has done its job and, right, it's not a critique of schools and called DCF, that's not gonna be a good relationship going forward, right? So it's being able to have the resources and the capacity to do that extra step that they all want to do, but don't always have the capacity to do.
Senator Buell.
I can wait, it's a funding question.
Sure.
Wanna wait for that?
Yeah, let's go. So, and we'll hustle it up. Thank you. Next slide. So these are some of our data sources. We don't have to spend a lot of time on it, but it's a mixture of qualitative and quantitative data. Because again, when I think even the national research bears this out, not just about community schools, but when you're thinking about student-centered learning, there's no one way to collect, say, like work-based learning data, because you can have any number of permutations, and so you have to have somewhat of the story to go with the quantitative data, so you understand and can contextualize it.
How about student performance?
Yes, that's the existing education and school health data from our data dashboards. Yeah. Next slide. We do definitely have several emerging themes that goes beyond these 5, but this is just an example. Connection and community resiliency. And, I have to tell you, we had a town manager say, I'm doing this because, like, my town is important to me. I'm participating on this coalition, and I want to make sure that I both am telling students about the story of our community, but also able to change the story of our community based on what their experiences are. Deeper learning. So again, from that literacy example to literally we, at Cabot, we showed up for a site visit and we were interviewing these students who were also teaching in the after school space. And this student had he's in the volunteer fire department. He had just put out the car fire the night before, but still showed up. And it was like, did you show up for us? Which of course he was kind of, no, like, who are you? He was like, I'm here because I have to teach in the after school program. But that idea of like true engagement, but also being able to say, like, we do need firefighters in this community. He then taught and certified 13 of the staff at the school.
These are the students?
This is a student.
in his senior X work-based learning senior project.
Terrific.
Right, so these are some of our emerging themes. I'm gonna sort of hustle a little bit. You know what, we can just go through the next 2, sort of go ahead, click through. So connection, community, resiliency, deeper learning, a focus on health and wellness, and it's amazing. They, last year, so they've been, at Virgin's growing, they have a community garden, but they also have these lettuce trees, which are really amazing. And that's a huge theme, which is almost all of our sites are engaging in growing their own food and distributing food.
Looks like there's a spa day going on there.
This is Educator Wellness Fridays at Hazen
Yeah.
High School,
Great.
because we're seeing also changes in staff, right?
Yeah.
Because a community school isn't just for students, it's for educators, families, and the broader community. And so this is Wellness Friday to
Well, and we
Hazen.
know that transfer, like if educators are not doing well, those students are gonna be. But the lettuce trees, it's amazing. We had a little data point. You don't have to move, thanks. But I was asking one of the principals, I was like, well, you have data, like, do your staff eat school lunch? And so he looked up, he was like, last year, same day, 2, and he was like, and it was me and my secretary. And I was like, well, what about that is school lunch? And I was like, well, what about this year, now that you've been bringing your community garden food into and it was 14 staff.
Wow.
Yeah. But that, you can't capture that data quantitatively, right? All right, so, and then re-engagement, we've talked about that.
That's a powerful quote. Hold on, let me just go back and read it, because this is from a preschool teacher in North Country through the restorative truancy program. So up in North Country, there is a caseload of 35 students that the school-based community school coordinator calls every single morning. to check in on attendance. My student is now at school more, attends on days when we don't have available busing. So talk about barriers to getting to school, right? It's transportation. I'm seeing huge developmental growth in the student due to consistent attendance, all thanks to the support of restorative truancy. So these are solutions that we have available, right? It might not be transportation solvable overnight, but with increased relational trust for some of our most vulnerable families, we can get them back in the building.
A few we'll nerd out on this because we love these quotes, so we're not gonna read them. We're gonna exercise self-control. Transferable skills, I'm exercising them right now. Next, but here might be some things of interest. So going through, and this is just this year's investment requests. Going through the grants management system, pulling this out, 80% of our community schools invested in 25 multi-tiered systems of support strategies, right? So they need to be implementing those multi-tiered systems of support.
So tell us so what does that look like?
Sure, so it's this idea of like your educators have data literacy, you collect data to inform decision-making, interventions, further investment requests, you are coordinating your curriculum, you are ensuring that you have services and supports that are just in time, right? It's everything that Act 173 was addressing when you're identifying those goals. 100% of community schools invested in 17 community-based organizations as part of their partnerships. 100% invested in 13 community-based learning strategies, in 5 work-based learning strategies. 100% invested in 17 strategies to support comprehensive health education, health and wellness, and community health. 100% invested in 14 strategies to support mental health, SEL, or social emotional learning and counseling. 100% invested in 15 strategies to support youth voice and student agency. And I think a great example would be the Students at Cabot that we had mentioned. 80% invested in 24 equity literacy strategies, 100% invested in 9 strategies to support culturally inclusive and sustaining school communities, and 100% invested in 12 connected literacy strategies. What I mean by that is literally the anti-bias, anti-racism reading initiative. So it's literacy and developing equity literacy at the same time, financial literacy, media and digital literacy. So what you're seeing is those things that we care about, that we're worried about, these folks are able to do in a way that is connected, that is meaningful to the community, to the parents, and to the students. Next slide. You want to take this slide?
Yeah, so 2.5 years in, we've got some preliminary outcomes that we wanted to share with you all because it's really exciting to see a 50% reduction in grade 9 absenteeism at one of the high schools. That is virtually unseen in the data. For example, in Baltimore, it took them 5 years to see a reduction in absenteeism and a multi-million-dollar investment prior to COVID. So seeing this happen in 2.5 years in is really, really exciting. 100% staff retention. No staff left the building last year. No
including
staff.
the community school coordinator moved into the guidance department, right? To stay. So it's also a pipeline, a pathway.
Did you have your hand up, Senator?
Did not. Thank you.
The next one is more speaking to the climate of the school. Educators wanted a holiday party this year. There hasn't been a holiday, just to showcase that they wanted to hang out with each other, that there's a collective climate of trust, relationships, and ownership in the space, as opposed to a toxic climate of like, get me out of here as soon as the bell rings, right? Student population is maintaining and actually attracting students. So Hazen was seeing students leave. They're actually seeing students come because of the flexible options and wraparound services that the school is able to provide.
And we're just spotlighting 2 because we could go on, but White River Valley, same thing. The high school actually had more people choose to go to the operating high school than the choice that they have, because there's choice towns.
Right. Really innovative offerings, the Hazen Ski and Ride with 24 community volunteers. You saw some of the Wellness Fridays happening for staff. Up in North Country, we were able to visit with the mobile arts educator. She's a mobile arts fan, talking about what's a community school, that I'm a parent, that I can show up at the North Troy town clerk on a Wednesday night from 5 to 8, get free pizza, and get to play with arts and crafts. And we have pictures of intergenerational learning of families they've never seen through the door, and a new family that moved to North Country, didn't know anyone and wanted to meet people and was able to access this program, right? So we're making community connections, and art is an equalizer. It doesn't require assumed knowledge or a space that if I have less than a 6th grade education. We met a mom whose 1st grader missed 100 days of school, 100 days of school. right? And that mom feels like the art place is a place that she can go to and not be judged and shamed, right? 100 Days School.
And the town clerk keeps all of everyone's artwork behind her desk for when they come in.
And that's a community school where the town clerk feels investment. I'm gonna open up my doors and we're gonna have the Van Gogh here because I'm invested in this community because this community is invested in me. It's a bi-directional relationship. Okay, next slide. So we just also wanted to highlight the really essential role of the coordinator. So that's a unique differentiating. If you had to look at what's a school versus a community school, they have this unique kind of position, the community school coordinator that was required as part of the legislation. And we're seeing this align with national research, the absolute essential role of the coordinator. So next slide. So just giving you a sense of national eyes, looking at the state of Vermont. Jess and I and Peter have had the privilege of going around to different national conferences. You heard Mary talk about, we went to the National Community Schools Conference in Philly, in this gigantic auditorium, and Mary's one of 5 coordinators in Vermont, and we got to meet and really network with across the country. And there's a lot of national attention and interest in what we're doing here. We've gone to several different conferences, we've academic publications, we've been invited to apply. We found out last night, actually, we were invited to apply to the Leahy Institute for Rural Partnerships grant to continue some of this work. So UVM's interested, the national networks are interested, and I think the story, the next chapter is gonna be really critical of how we're sustaining this.
Next slide. So I think it's also important to know that there is tons of national research and we're doing state-specific work as part of our evaluation, which we're hoping to produce for our report that's due next year. But a 7-to-1 ratio return on investment. For every $1 that we invest in community schools, that you're getting a return of $7.11. I do love the 11 cents. More powerful somehow. But I think this idea too of saying, you can pay now or you can pay later, and when you pay later, you pay a lot more. So when you think about court-involved youth, justice-involved families, opioid crisis, mental health crisis, unemployment or underemployment or lack of interest in employment, right? Those things come when you start to get further and further disconnected. When you're not literate, we know if you're reading at the 6th grade level or below, you are earning $28,000 less on average. So this is a return on investment that hopefully folks feel like it has been invested wisely, and I think we're seeing that bear out. Next slide. I also am including, so these are strategies for sustainability, and again, I'm just conscious of time, so I want to get to the last slide, which is something that I had shared previously to USED and in some conferences, and also if you're talking to the congressional delegation, to be clear that when people say, oh, there's a federal program, first of all, SEAs cannot apply. So we can't even do that work on behalf of our districts. Now, I mentioned I was
SEA's.
State Education Agency.
So you guys.
Agency of Education.
Okay.
When I worked in New York City,
Yeah.
that education, that public education system, its population was 1.2 million people. That's twice the population of Vermont.
Yeah.
So when Los Angeles Public Schools is applying and they are recipients, that is something that Cabot cannot compete against, right? And one of the things that I would recommend and have recommended, that if you really want to scale community schools, if you think that this is a return on investment at the national level, that to structure it like a existing federal program, which is the 21st Century Community Learning Centers. That's the after-school program, the Nita M. Lowey after-school program. They have an allocation to the state. The state then can manage it, and it makes it available. We can then compete it. We have 86 sites right now in Vermont who are after-school programs receiving, federal dollars. That is something that you can say, we've sustained that for 2 decades, right? If there's been some up and down, we've been over 100, we've been, in the 80s, but generally around that. That would be a recommendation I would make to the congressional delegation. And if you are speaking to the congressional delegation, to ensure that small rural states like Vermont have a fair shake at this kind of programming, because most of the national research is focused on urban environments. And hopefully we have not bored you to death.
No, it's been terrific.
2 o'clock.
You have too much energy.
The 2 of us together is dangerous.
And I literally just flew in, I got back at 2:30 a.m. It's like, I've had a little bit of coffee here, folks, sorry.
So these 6 folks,
5 supervisors.
Five supervisors.
Yeah.
The people that were in these positions have now transitioned into other
No.
positions, or summer
No,
schools are
so-
trying to keep them?
Yes, so there are some schools, right, but
Right.
again, I think we all know that not all communities are funded the same, resourced the same. I mean, even just like I live in Groton, there's 900 people.
Yeah.
Right, it's the post office and the public library that's open 2 days a week.
Yeah.
And so from that perspective, we do have, and I will say that's what I'm struggling with. Like, this is the thing that like I'm really struggling with, which is we asked them to do this.
I know.
And now we have people who don't know yet if they're going to get a contract.
That's a good segue into my question.
Yeah.
Which is, I'm sure that the ask will be, if we want to continue these positions, for them to come from the ed fund, and yet I'm thinking to myself, like, this is a municipality position, this is a public health position, this could come from AHS, this could come from, it just seems like there are a lot of buckets that we could be drawing money from to
There-
support this.
100%. And I would say if you look at that position, right? Because again, some of those metrics that I shared, we have a ton of them. The focus is also on education, right? And so there is a role for 100% a role for education in this. But I think that idea of braiding makes a ton of sense. Ag, there's a bill out there right now. But I also would say that you and I were on a committee and talking about a program that was a dropout program. And we have an opportunity to sort of shift and say, I think we all are in need of a little bit of hope and inspiration, right? I think we need to be thinking about what is our future. I was just in Annapolis at this Service to Career conference with the National Governors Association and talking with our, Serve Vermont folks and Serve Learn and Earn folks. And folks who are participating, the young people who are participating, they are worried about the world. They want to save the world. And you understand why, right? We need to be, community schools is well positioned when you think about how much community-based learning, work-based learning, service learning is happening there. The fact that it is centering community, we are growing up young people to be ready to serve, right? To solve problems, to save the world. And we have an opportunity to think about pivoting. Do we invest in cynicism or do we invest in optimism? And this is optimistic.
I hate to leave it
Yes,
here.
please.
I do.
But thank you
This has
for
been
your
incredible.
time.
Thanks
Thank you.
for your passion.
Yeah, for everything you do. We all recognize how hard you work. Thank you so much.
I would also like to recognize Peter, who's been back here and
Peter, who I was just
does
about
so
to
much
call
data.
Patrick. I'm glad.
Yes.
But then Peter, thank you as well for being here. Thank you all.
Yeah, of course.
having us.
Yeah,
Thanks for your
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
You were all inspirational.
Oh,
Thank you very
thank
much.
you. We're not short on energy, so.
Committee, 5 minutes in case you want to say
You come
goodbye or
every
touch
Friday.
base.
Yeah, that's why Jeff said yes.